Hi, everyone, and thanks again to James Yang for that wonderful animation. It was delightful to see, and then we're going to get more thoughts from our other honorees today about that animation. Thanks to see you. All right, we're honored here today to be joined by Dr. Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank, who needs no introduction, and we're going to get a little bit of insight into his life and his career, especially as it relates to our community and how to address the challenge for future generations, which is part of the theme for today's Korean American Day. So Dr. Kim, so nice to see you. And I love the little chat we had before we got on. He's a foodie, and he watches my foodie show. So I'm so proud and excited. He watches the news too, of course, obviously, because of his job. But I love that we share affinity for food. That's terrific. So let's get right into it. Number one, what inspired you to pursue a career first in medicine and in public health?
Well, you know, I've always liked science, but you know, we came to this country when I was 5 years old, and grew up in Iowa. In the you know, for the Koreans in the audience, Iowa is what you'd call 아주시고, right? So it's really in the it's isolated. It's a fantastic place to grow up. We love growing up there. But you know, it was very clear to us that we were minorities. And my father was a dentist. You know, dentists are among the most practical people in the world. And my mother is a philosopher, maybe among the least practical people in the world. So I had these two influences, and my mother, from a very young age, had me read books about Martin Luther King. I mean, I actually remember watching Martin Luther King in 1968 and remember the assassination. She tried in the middle of Iowa to keep us aware of all the greatest social issues. So that was my concern. I wanted to be a social activist. I wanted to go into politics. Those are the things that were most exciting to me. And I remember, and I've told this story before, so if people have heard it, I apologize. But after my sophomore year, I came home, and my father picked me up from the airport, and we were driving home. And he said, so what are you going to study? And I said, you know, I think I really want to study philosophy and political science. So my practical father, dentist, pulled the car over to the side of the road.
This sounds familiar. This story sounds familiar.
He looked back at me and he said the equivalent at the time of like, ya ima. He said, hey, look, buddy. Quite literally, he said, once you finish your internship and residency, you can do anything you want.
Right, of course. Right. Don't set the foundation.
So what a great opportunity for me that I had this incredibly practical father. And he used to say it this way. He said, look, you are a minority. You look at yourself in the mirror. You know, you are going to have a real skill. You're not going to be able to get by in this society by talking or, you know, by being part of a group. You are a minority. You need something practical. And I'll forever be grateful to him for doing that, because this is the work that I do now. You know, you can study economic development, and I was really inspired by the little piece by Eugene. You can read development theory. You can think about, you know, the importance of financial markets and all that. But as a physician, going as I have and worked in places like Haiti and Peru, you actually see poverty and how it is condensed into the bodies of people. The people who have tuberculosis don't have it because they happen to be uniquely susceptible. They have it because they're poor. They have, you know, in so many ways, HIV went along the fault lines of society, meaning it was the most poor and the most marginalized who were getting infected. So as a physician, you know, I had a skill, which was great, but also I got to sort of understand poverty and inequality in quite literally a corporeal way. When you see it, when you see how inequality and poverty becomes embodied in people's illnesses, it made me very happy to be a physician, but also gave me a deep sense that I had to do more than just treat individual patients.
That's right. And then that experience in public health was a natural progression into international development for you?
Absolutely, yeah. You know, for the past almost 30 years now, I've been working on global development, and mostly on health, but also education, social protection, meaning, you know, developing programs that will support people. And I've also been teaching and doing research. So I've been doing all those different things. And just completely out of the blue, I have this now unbelievable opportunity to lead the World Bank.
And can I just go back to something you mentioned about what your father had said to you and how it relates to this generation? You said that your father said as a minority you have to have a skill.
Yeah.
Now, in 2013, how does that relate to this generation that wants to make a difference? Does that still apply? And then how, for our young children who feel very American, who understand they have Korean heritage, but who feel like this country is theirs as much as anyone else's?
Yeah. I think it's changed a lot. I think it's changed enormously. And when our parents came here, it seemed so clear that you had to be an engineer, you had to get your PhD, you had to go to law school, you had to do something. And my father said it exactly this way: you have to have something that no one can take away from you, right? But I think it's different now. I think I see young people, Korean Americans, who are in leading positions in investment banks, doing private equity, doing foodie shows and being lead anchors. I mean, I think the world has changed a lot. And so my advice is really quite different than what my father gave me. What I tell people is, the most important thing is find something that you feel just really passionate about. You feel like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I get to wake up every morning and do this. Because that's now how the world's changed. And I think that's fantastic that the world has changed in that way. Now, I have chosen to work in an area where the whole point is to try to give people more choices. I mean, this is the biggest thing that you see around poverty, is that people who are living in terrible situations of poverty really don't have any choices. So now that so many Korean Americans have choices, what I tell them is make the most use of them. I still think it's useful to get some kind of skill where you can actually contribute something. I think that's useful. But it's also more important that people do things they love.
Okay. And you've been able to offer some choices with your career path. You were the first Asian American president of an Ivy League university as the president of Dartmouth, and then you transitioned into this current job where you can literally change the world. What was that transition like, going from Dartmouth to the World Bank, and not necessarily to similar fields?
Well, it was hard. It was a tough decision. I still wear my Dartmouth tie.
I know. I see the Dartmouth green.
I love that institution, and it was a job that I had planned to be in for a long time. These are not university presidencies are not short-term jobs. But I'll tell you the story. I think at this point, since he's retiring, I can tell you the story. Tim Geithner is a Dartmouth grad, as was Hank Paulson before him, you see. So all the good and bad in the American economy is due to Dartmouth. Right?
Is that good for you or bad for you?
No, but I have to tell you, they're two very different people, but both Hank and Tim are just extraordinary individuals. And I got a call from Tim, and it was the very week that they were going to make the announcement of the next person who's going to run the World Bank. And Tim, when he calls me, it's usually because he has a friend who he wants to, put in a good word for to get into Dartmouth. And so that's what I expected. But he said, would you be interested in being president of the World Bank? And my jaw dropped. And I said, you mean the World Bank? And he said, yeah. And then he said, I said, well, of course. I mean, it's been my life's work. I've got a great job, but if this is a possibility, I have to look at it. So he said, can you come down and see the president? I said, sure. And when? He said, how about tomorrow?
No pressure.
So it was a Monday, and I was actually nominated on that Friday. Right?
Wow.
So it happened very, very quickly.
You had time to process.
Well, if you think about it a little bit, it means that I was pretty far down the list of choices. On the one hand, I'm being honest and humble about the reality of the situation. But my goodness, what an opportunity! And I'll just tell you a little story. That morning was Friday morning. We were sitting in the office, looking out, about to walk out into the Rose Garden. And it was President Obama, Secretary Clinton, who had originally nominated me, Secretary Geithner, who was very supportive. I mean, it was just as incredible sitting in this room. And President Obama said to me, so how's your family dealing with this? And I said, well, it's very much of a surprise. And the only person who's having some real trouble with it is my 11-year-old son, Thomas. And so President Obama said, so does he have a nickname? I said, yeah, we call him TJ. So he wrote it down. I said, where could I reach him later today if I wanted to call him? Right? So I gave him my wife's cell phone number, right? And we went out and we did the ceremony. And then I sent my wife an email, a text saying, President Obama says he might call TJ later today. Right?
FYI, it's not a prank call.
She texted me back, yeah, right. So about 6 o'clock that evening, right, my wife was driving down the road, and the phone call came up, and it said unknown, right? So she just pushed it and handed it back to TJ, right?
Oh my goodness. And
President Obama's secretary comes on and says, this is the president's office. Can you take a call from President Obama? And here's my 11-year-old kid saying, sure, yeah. He called, and at the end of, he's saying, oh, Thomas, he asked him, of course. I mean, come on, this is the president of the United States. He doesn't have to do this. He was asking him, how do you like school? What do you like in school? And he's got a daughter around the same age, and so they talked a little while. And says, Thomas, I understand you feel bad about this, but your father's going to do a lot of good things, and so I guess I owe you one. So my son spent the rest of the weekend thinking about what he could ask President Obama for.
Smart kid. That is smart. That is smart.
So he came up with things like a ride in the armored car. But I think his best idea is that he was going to ask if he could have a birthday party on Air Force One.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Ain't happening though, I tell you.
Yeah, maybe on the South Lawn, but I don't know, on Air Force One. What a great story.
But, it's just, and then, I had worked with President Clinton before. I'd met Secretary Clinton many times. And, of course, Tim and Carol Geithner are both Dartmouth graduates, so I knew them quite well. So it was just really just many completely unthinkable events coming together that led to me having this responsibility. But think about it. We are the most important development institution. We're about a $50 billion a year institution. We are working on the most fundamental issues of ending poverty and what we call boosting shared prosperity. The thing that people want more than anything else is a good job. We know that the future of funding global health programs, the future of funding educational programs is that economies grow and people have good jobs. We know that that's the case, and we work with so many countries throughout the world in tackling these fundamental issues. And so, at the World Bank, we tackle issues like health and education, social protection programs. We tackle climate change, because if we don't get on top of climate change, all the efforts we've made in ending poverty are going to be for naught. Mm-hmm. So we get to work on all these things, and in addition, we work with countries to try to create growth and dynamism in their private sector. So it's just, Jim Wolfensohn, who was a very good friend and former president of the World Bank, when I was nominated, I called him right away, and he said, Jim, Robert McNamara told me that the World Bank presidency is the best job in the world, and that even if he had to pay to be in the job, he would have done it. Right? McNamara and Jim Wolfensohn, they have a lot more resources than I do, so I'm very happy to be paid to do this job. But Jim Wolfensohn said the same thing. He said, it's the best job on earth. And I have to say, at this point, I completely agree.
Now, you mentioned some of the issues you were talking about. Do you see those as the greatest global development challenges so far in your tenure there?
Well, right now we're still in the middle of a really difficult economic situation. Growth is not as quick as we've expected. One of the good things, though, is that the developing and middle-income countries have really grown quite nicely. I mean, the Latin America had been growing very well and is recovering quickly. And, one of the great untold stories is that Africa is growing at about a 5% rate throughout this crisis. And so there are lots of bright spots. I think, we are involved in this every day. We're watching what's happening in Europe. We're watching what's happening here. And the stability of the global economy is a huge issue, and it always will be. And it's a huge issue, and it always will be for us, because when the rich world sneezes, everyone in the poor world gets the flu. So we're watching very carefully because the worse things get, the worse it will be, especially for the poorest. So we watch that. I'm very concerned with climate change. I mean, you saw that there's a New York Times article today. The extreme weather events continue. The evidence is overwhelming that climate change is real, that man-made climate change is real. And I don't think people understand what the implications are. So the most important way for me to illustrate it is, if we don't meet our emissions targets, if we don't get on top of the climate change issue, a 2 degree plus world could happen as early as 2060, right?
2060.
So 2060. So 2060, in 2060, my 3-year-old son will be my age, right? And he'll be living in a world where the oceans have acidified, where the fisheries won't be reliable. These extreme weather events will be happening all the time. There will be enormous struggles over basic access to water and food. It will be a world that looks completely different from the world we have today. And the point is, many have said we're already past the threshold. It's going to look like that. But what we believe is that the World Bank, along with many partners, along with the environmental organizations, the awareness of this issue is very high in Europe. It's very high in China. I was just in China, and they emit a lot of carbon, but my goodness, they're very focused on moving toward renewable energy. We can get on top of it, but the thing that I want to make clear to everybody is if you have a 3-year-old child or if you have a 3-year-old grandchild, what you've got to understand is if we don't act aggressively on climate change, the world they live in will be daily fights over access to water, daily fights over access to food. It will be a world that does not look like the world we live in today. So for us, when we talk about shared prosperity, we mean, what we know is that if you build societies where there's a lot of economic growth, but it doesn't include young people, for example, you get things like the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring fundamentally was about inclusion, was about participation. So there's no simple answer. Just having a growing economy doesn't assure you of a functioning, successful society. You've got to include people, especially young people. The other thing we know is if you don't include women in economic development, you're not going to have a stable a path toward growth. The participation of women in economic development is critical. But the biggest issue about shared prosperity is we have to share our prosperity with future generations. So at the World Bank, we talk about ending poverty, building shared prosperity. Those are the two things that we work on. And so issues are interrelated, but the stability of the economic environment, climate change, and all of its implications have to get us thinking, not just about today, but what's it going to take to build prosperity for the medium, the long term, and even for our children and grandchildren.
I have a 4-year-old, so to think about that is really chilling, for sure. You did tell us a little bit about your parents and your influences. Any other critical moments or important times in your life or influences in your life that shaped who you are and your career path that you could share with us, and that could also translate into advice for people who are trying to accomplish some of the goals that you've planned out here, it may be on the level that they're working or for their future as well?
Yeah, it's hard to. There's no simple. But let me try to just relay some of my experiences. And I think one of the things that I've done again and again in the different environments and different projects I've taken on is I've tried to be really rigorous about asking, well, why can't we do that? It's just a simple question. Why can't we do that? And in so many of the organizations I work in, I come in and say, well, you can't do it that way. And I say, why? They say, well, we've never done it that way, right? And I keep asking questions. At Dartmouth, I would ask, well, is it against New Hampshire law to do it a different way, right? And as long as it's not, then we go forward. It's the same question I'm asking inside the World Bank. People say, well, it takes too long. Well, why does it take too long? And we're trying to figure out exactly why we're slow when we're slow. Because when we're facing an emergency situation like Haiti or Aceh, my goodness, we've gotten things done in a fraction of the time. Instead of 18 months, we've gotten everything done in weeks to months. So I think it's really important to have extremely high aspirations in anything you've been doing. And it's better, I have found, rather than focusing in on, for example, a lot of managers come in and they try to reorganize the organizational chart and they get into the single processes. I think it's really important always to know, why are you doing what you're doing? And then take that and go backwards. And so at the World Bank, we're saying, well, so why do we do what we do? And as I've walked around the entire institution here in Washington and many country offices, I've asked the question, so why are you here? What do you want to do? And the World Bank is full of unbelievably qualified people. But when you scratch a little bit, they're there because they have a passion to fight poverty, right? Now, that passion to fight poverty may have been not something that they were thinking every day as they've been there for 30 years, but you scratch a little bit, it's there. So we have a passion to fight poverty. Okay, what's the vision? End poverty, build shared prosperity. How do we go about doing that? Well, one of the problems is that the processes are too cumbersome. All right, we're going to change them. We're going to change them, and we're going to keep going at it until we change them, because the goal has to be to actually end poverty. And so this is the goal that I've set for the team. And it's great, again, to see Eugene's work. What I've told them is, what would it take to end poverty, absolute poverty, in much less time that we're thinking about? And I asked the question, so what do you think it's going to take? Well, if we go in the way that we're going right now, it's going to take about 25 years. So my question has been, what would it take to end poverty in 10 years? Right? What would we have to do differently if we were going to end poverty in 10 years? So once you have a really compelling goal, everything else falls into place. Then the things that people thought that they could never do, they think, well, if that's the goal, my goodness, we've got to figure out a way to get there. So set really high aspirations and then figure out how to get there as you go along.
I'm going to have a long conversation with my producers when I get back to the station. Thank you, Dr. Kim. We're going to talk to Dr. Kim a little bit more, but speaking of ending poverty and the work to do that, if I can invite Eugene Cho and Kyung up here. Oh, there she is. And you have to understand how tickled I am and how honored I am to be up here with Kyung. She is such a trailblazer for my profession, and so many of us, Asian American women especially, who did not have a whole lot of role models to look up to, have always admired Kyung for the work that she did, not only on camera, but for then what she did with her status and her resources to then do good for the whole entire community. So I'm honored to be here with you, Kyung Yoon and Eugene, all the work that you're doing. If I could talk a little bit to both of you. Let me start with you, Kyung, about your organization and the mission that you have, not only reaching Korean Americans in philanthropy, but then getting the Korean American, the broader community interested and excited, and then do something more than just give money, as you had mentioned in the video.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have to say that, really bad timing. You talked about people catching the flu.
No.
So I actually brought my sort of cough drops up here with me in case I need it.
No.
But thank you so much, and it's such an honor to be here. I have to say 10 years ago, when I was privileged to be part of a small, well, not so small, group of Korean American professionals who were invited by the then Consul General, Jo Wan-il, to his residence. We were kind of, some of us knew each other. Juju Chang was there and I, and because we'd been in the broadcast media world, we knew each other, but there were others like YSG and Sunny Huang who are here, from the legal profession, from publishing world. We didn't know each other, and it was kind of a wonderful moment where we were so happy to meet each other, but then we realized that we were also very challenged to say, what have we been doing in our American journey? We have been so kind of individually focused on our own success, and that was sort of the message that we got from our parents. You just go forward and you just do the best you can, and that's great. And I really do think that for the first generation, that was what they wanted of their kids, and just because they were very much in a different mode than today in terms of being in a survival mode of just 먹고 살고, and if they have a little bit left over, they put it into their children's education. And there we were, the beneficiaries of all that great investment, and yet we understood that if we all go our separate ways and there isn't some way to pull the strings of our individual success stories to somehow translate into more of a community success and to uplift our community, that it's just going to be a Korean American community that moves on from generation to generation, that never gets bonded, that never is organized, that is not stronger. And that was the genesis of the Korean American Community Foundation idea of harnessing all of our sort of Rolodexes and resources and our hearts, because in the end, many of us didn't even speak Korean, and yet if we had an hour of volunteer time to give or $1 to give, we kind of really wanted to give back and maybe help 할아버지들은 할머니들 in our community or find some way, but we were very disconnected. And so that was sort of where KACF started, and it was really the mission, and it has always been around helping the most marginalized, the most vulnerable members, not just in our community, but in the larger APA, Asian American community, but also building bridges to other communities as well, recognizing the Korean Americans, that we are not an insular group, that this is our home, and that we want to be a community that ultimately makes America a better place.
Thank you, Kim. And Eugene, you have worked with and witnessed the most marginalized and people who are living in the most impoverished situations. What are the challenges in building your organization and getting people to say, okay, if I don't see it, then it doesn't affect me? I mean, and you mentioned it's 0.04% is one-day wages for most Americans. But does that resonate still? Are you finding reluctance? Like, what are the challenges in getting people to help you build what you're trying to do in your mission?
Well, let me begin again by just thanking the organization for having Kyung and myself here, our spouses. It's a true honor to be here. To answer your question, I think it's really multifaceted. It's very complex. We live in such a complex and nuanced world. I think there's a pro and con of the fact that in our world we have access to so much information. So I have not yet met anyone when I speak about issues of global poverty or extreme poverty where they say, I never knew this. We all know something, but I think at the same time we're inundated with so much information that we can become somewhat desensitized, that we can hide behind numbers. So I'm reticent at times speaking about statistics because I think in the middle of statistics, people can be so overwhelmed by numbers like 2.7 billion people living under $2 that we sometimes lose the humanity of one person. Dr. Kim was speaking about when you see poverty in the confines of flesh and blood of a person. That is something that I think we have to be reminded of. And so for me, I think it's trying to humanize these issues of global poverty, whether it's in our neighborhood, whether it's in our country, whether it's in the larger world, is that I think part of our task is to humanize these stories. And in doing so, I think this is not just for the purpose of helping others. I think in many ways, if I can maybe get a little philosophical, in some ways it's to free us as well from maybe the tyranny of sometimes our greed, maybe the tyranny of our apathy. But that would also be a second challenge, is how do we inspire people from apathy or feeling so overwhelmed that they're paralyzed to saying we can do something. One of my hopes is to be upfront in speaking with those who've chosen to engage with us. And I just tell people, no, you cannot change the entire world. That would be selling a lie, in my opinion. We can't change the whole world, but we can change the world of some. And in that process, my invitation is that we can be changed ourselves. A few years ago, when my wife Min-hee and I made that decision to start One Day's Wages and to give up a year's wages, honestly, I think it was because we were convicted by our faith in Christ, but we wanted to change the world. I can tell you in honesty and looking back that a good chunk of this journey has been that we have been changed. Our eyes have been open. We've been more humanized. And so I think there's a kind of a multifaceted, but those are some of the things that we're trying to do in the ways that we communicate with our donors.
When you humanize the poor
Yeah.
and we see the faces and the stories and the names, what's next then? What is a way to inspire people, compel them to do more than just say, write a check?
Yep. Yeah.
And especially for our generation and I feel like the next generation, we're just and this is one of my favorite excuses. We're busy. I'm raising 3 children. I have a full-time job. How do you find time, and what is the best way then to contribute and feel like you're making a difference?
Well, I think the good thing is that I don't think any organization has a monopoly on how to do this well. There's not one way. I'm so grateful that even on this stage here, you see organizations on different tiers approaching it in different ways. I think it speaks to the idea that we need to be very creative We need to be tenacious. We need to be compassionate in the ways that we go about our work. We live in my opinion, a cynical world. There's those that are inspired, but I think we're also fighting cynicism. And I think part of that cynicism is, will this really work? Will this really help? And I think part of what we need to do is to go about the work that we do with as much integrity as possible. We need to communicate that people's donations, their volunteering time does have an impact. So part of what we're trying to do is, one, in our storytelling, we want to have integrity and dignity in our storytelling. And I think one of the things that's a really strong commitment for me is we don't want to dehumanize the poor in our attempt to humanize them. And what I mean by that is sometimes I think it's atrocious that we can just flop a random picture of that African boy with a bloated stomach and snot coming down that person's nose. And in doing so, we're trying to do good, but at the same time, we're dehumanizing the dignity of that person's life, of that child's life. So I think we have to be really careful, honest, and have integrity in our storytelling. But I think we also have to communicate to our donors, in a sense, from A to Z, how that money is making an impact, and to prove it if you can, to convey it as much as we can. Now, it's not perfect. Anyone that tells you, whether it's locally in New York City, in Seattle, anyone that tells you that work, relief work, development work is pretty glamorous or sexy, they're lying, in my opinion. It's hard work. It's messy and laborious. And so our hope is to be able to compel people, not with guilt, not with fear, not with shame, but as honestly as we can, to communicate that we are making an impact and we can do so with their assistance. Last thing I'll share is I feel very compelled to communicate to people in a culture and world, particularly in our Western world, particularly as Korean Americans, where I think we are definitely in this mode of upward mobility. Now, my parents came here as immigrants in '77. They knew 2 or 3 words: hello, thank you, please. And they worked, our family, classic Korean immigrant story, worked at the grocery store, Royal Pine Market in San Francisco. They woke up at 6 a.m., opened the store at 7 a.m., closed the shop at 11 p.m. They were never able to have dinner at home because they ate it at the store. I'm moved and inspired by them. And one of the things that they have conveyed to me again and again and again is that we are so blessed. We are blessed. And sometimes our culture tells us, you need more, you need more. And while there may be truth to that in certain social economic settings, I think there is something to be said about we are blessed. And much has been given to us, and much is to be expected. And so I want to inspire people by simply conveying to them how blessed we are, in part because of the fact that so many have invested in us. So I'm grateful. I stand here and sit here because I know that I'm not an island to myself. My parents, my family, my ancestors, those that came before us 110 years ago, truly paved the way for us.
Indeed. All right. And Kyung, speaking of the next generation and the challenges facing the new generation of people who are going to be leaders and decision makers and get into more influential roles in the community, do you find similar challenges of finding upward mobility, caring about what's going to be left in their future generations? What do you see the next generation dealing with, especially getting involved in making a difference, not only in their community, but more globally as well?
I think actually the next generation is a really hopeful generation. I have been so inspired by, in our work with organizing Korean Americans in the New York City area, the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings, who have all come to New York in droves, to pursue their investment banking careers or whatever. They are hungry to be connected and to give back and to find something that's meaningful. But as you said, they're busy, and they don't have a lot of time. And I think for them, to find a vehicle that is transparent, that is efficient, that has impact, it means a great deal that if you do, again, have that dollar to give or an hour of volunteer time, that you can give it in a way that resonates for you and that you can see what the impact is. I think that in the challenge in the Korean American community, as I see it, is that a lot of first generation organizations that exist, like the Korean associations that primarily speak in English language, so Korean language, and that have a lot of the cultural sort of trappings in a way. They have not moved in a way that it is welcoming or relevant to Korean American generation. I came, to America when I was 6 years old, and my Korean actually has gotten better in recent years just because of this work, but it's not that fluent. I'm not that comfortable in with all the I'm afraid I'm going to offend somebody. I just still think of sometimes all of that as being sort of my parents' generation, and it took KACF for me to redefine what does it mean to be Korean American and to really realize this is our home. It's not about looking back to Korea, and Korea is so important, and we so need and appreciate the work that KEI does with U.S.-Korea relations and all of that, but we so appreciate that you're recognizing Korean American Day, that we are saying we are here, this is our journey, and we want to be in the driver's seat of this journey, not just sitting in the back seat and letting somebody else decide whether we turn right or left and just being grateful to be in the car. That is the past, and I feel like this is the kind of organizations that we need to foster going forward. And just finally, I would say that what I envision, for strengthening the Korean American community, like Eugene said, sometimes you have a picture of, the African child, and it's not human, but to a Korean American, let's say, but who's right at the brink of thinking about giving back. And I think the idea that most of the donors to KACF have never donated before, and most of our grantee partners have never received institutional funding before, we realize that we are sort of at the nexus of something that is very important, because when you get in the habit of giving, then you can start to really think of yourself as a philanthropist. We all close our eyes and we say, philanthropist, the word. What do you think of? Think of the Carnegies, maybe you think of Bill Gates, but we don't think of people who look like us. But we can be philanthropic. And I have to say, along with my cough drops, I brought with me the New York Times. This was the day before yesterday. We're on the front page of the New York Times with an article saying that Asians in the U.S. are gaining influence in philanthropy. They had a photo of our gala that attracted 1,000 people, that raised over $1 million. We're on the brink of something that is just so exciting. And just to have immigrants being recognized not as the groups that are just coming and sapping the system, but actually that we are giving back to, I think this is really hopeful for the next generation.
Well, and I think for sure, speaking of people who are in the driver's seat, the three individuals up here indeed are showing that you take leadership positions and then pay that forward. Dr. Kim, so what now? So are we in the driver's seat? How do we stay in the driver's seat? How do we get more people in the vehicles behind the driver's seat? What happens to our children and this next young generation who don't feel as many of the inhibitions maybe our generation, where we are straddled between our parents who were immigrants speaking one language, we're speaking another language. So for our children, they're going to have a completely different relationship and a point of reference for when they're trying to build their community and take on leadership positions.
Yeah, as I hear the stories, and I've known Kyung for a long time, and listened to Eugene and Kyung talking. There's just this. We have to remember that our parents' generation remember deep poverty. Right? My mother walked from Seoul to Busan with her youngest brother on her back in the middle of the war. And, it was interesting. I was in Latvia talking with the Latvian Minister of Finance, and he said to me, you know why the Latvians have been able to respond so quickly to the crisis? Because we remember what it's like to live in poverty, just like you Koreans do. right? Now, frankly, I don't, right? Mike,
Right, like, wait a minute.
and that's a real disadvantage for us, right? And what was so real about that was that they came, and there's hardiness. You remember during the time when the late 1990s, the Korean crisis, Korean people from their own, they took the earrings off their ears and they made donations to the central bank of $1 billion in jewelry and gold because they wanted to save the country. So that sense of common purpose, the sense of remembering what it was like to live in poverty, that gave them an enormous amount of meaning. And what it drove them to tell us was, work hard, get a degree, focus on your studies, 잘 먹고 잘 살아라, that kind of, you need to focus on the basics, right? But I think inevitably, especially among Koreans, I have to just say, and I hope I'm not being too inward looking, but I just have to say that I think Koreans are a very soulful people. You can see it, I was told once that Koreans are the Irish of the Orient, very soulful, very depressed, maybe drink too much. But I heard this a lot, and I have to say, it's true. 인정이란 무엇인가. We have this very strong sense of connectedness to each other, and I think it inevitably leads people to ask questions like the three of us did in doing our work, which is, okay, we're going to get to a place where we can eat and live well, but what's the deeper meaning here? What's really important? What's really important for us as individuals and as a people? And I think Eugene and Kyung have asked this in profound ways and responded in profound ways, and I think that's what's going to happen. And I would argue that the true influence in this society is not going to be just focusing, staying in the background, taking the safe professions, making money. That's not what's going to take us to the next level. What's going to take us to the next level is for us, just like our parents did in their own way, given their situation, engage with the most basic, profound issues of humankind.
And what do you think that will look like?
I think it will look like people engaging in politics, engaging in philanthropy. It'll engaging in international organizations like I'm doing. Maybe becoming physicians, but being deeply concerned about access to healthcare for everybody. That you get the skill, you get the mastery, but then you take that next step and say, what does it mean for not just my family and maybe my little group, but for the world?
Eugene, in the work that you're doing, are you seeing the impact of what Dr. Kim, what Kyung is saying in terms of getting people involved in your organization? Are you seeing the next generation wanting to take the next step? And tell us about that experience in trying to get people to participate more in the one-day wages.
Sure. I think the jury is still out, if I can be. I'm a recovering cynic myself.
Okay.
And maybe it's Seattle, maybe it's the rain. It could be that. There's so much to be hopeful about. And yet I think at the same time, if we open our news and look around us, you also see so much pain and brokenness as well. Part of, I think, my challenge to this and coming generations, and I'll just group all of us together, is I think if we're not careful, that particularly as individuals, in a world where we're so driven by consumption of media, in a new media world, social media world, if we're not careful, my fear is that we could end up falling more in love with the idea of changing the world than changing the world. Because we're so enamored by that idea. It's hopeful, it's beautiful. We see stories of Bill Gates and philanthropists that we could, in a sense, that there's something different about immersing ourselves in the stories of others and then being challenged and convicted in such a way that we ourselves move from a bystander participant to getting involved. So one of the reasons why I am encouraged by the story of One Day's Wages is we're trying to, as Kyung was saying, is that we're trying to convey to people that every single one of us can be a philanthropist. The root definition of a philanthropist is, its basic essence is a lover of humanity. That we can all grow in our love for humanity in some way. No matter what our worldviews, for me, I come from a Christian perspective, so my wife and I, everything that we do is in response to our faith and conviction in Christ. But this idea of loving humanity, doing good to others, that's something that can be shared by all and needs to be. I think it's the great equalizer in bringing people. One Day's Wages, there's two ways that we do that. Number one, the whole concept of 0.4%. Because some folks will respond by saying, but I'm not a millionaire. And we say, well, is it possible that you can invest 0.4% at least once a year? We're crowdsourcing. We're getting many, many people involved. We recently funded a project where we were able to raise enough funds to do heart life-saving surgeries for 20 Iraqi children and to provide 5,000 hours of training and mentoring for local Iraqi doctors. And that was possible through $10,000 of crowdsourcing. The other thing that we love to do is that we love open source collaboration. So our website, we encourage people, as you saw in the video, where people take 5 minutes to create their own birthday campaign. And they can choose where they are asking their friends and family to give. So once a year, that's because you celebrate your birthday once a year, but maybe on a regular basis, in lieu of flowers and gifts and cards, can you give to my birthday cause as I raise funds for the Water Fund? And we've had so many amazing, compelling ideas, people that have chosen to partner with us. We just had a 16-year-old Asian kid bicycle 3,200 miles from Alabama all the way to LA to raise over $10,000 for our Water Fund. We've had people do hip-hop contests, run marathons, just you name it. And it's because we're trying to empower them from going from loving the idea, being moved by some particular cause, and doing something where it immerses their life in some way.
Wonderful. And maybe, Kyung, if you could explain maybe ways to get people to go from the idea of wanting to change the world, because it is such a broad concept, and it does seem like, oh, I want to be a do-gooder, to taking the first steps, even if you're not in a position to be what others might perceive as a philanthropist, but to say, you know what, I can take X, Y, Z in my goals, in my vision, in the next steps of my life.
Yeah, so one of the things that we have taken on in the New York area is really around sort of helping people who are interested to really learn more about their community. And so, for example, we practice what we call participatory grant making, so that even though ultimately the grant decisions are made by our board of directors, we have a committee called the Community Grants Committee, and that can be our board members or our steering committee members or volunteers. They commit to getting training on community issues, on how to read a grant application, on actually being able to go on a site visit. And under the supervision of our professional staff, our program officer, they get to go and learn and see firsthand what are the needs and what are some of the solutions that are happening in our community. And they come back and they make grant recommendations. Sometimes they say no, many times they say yes, and many times they get personally very invested, so passionate. And I do feel that that has been a real DNA, underlying philosophy of KACF, that it is about democratic philanthropy. Again, you don't have to wait until your first million. In fact, our slogan is $1 a day for our neighbors, so less than a cup of coffee a day. $365 a year, it can be change to somebody, but it can be a significant amount to others. But we've always said, as much as we would love a wealthy donor to come to us and give us $365,000, that ultimately for us, we would much rather have 1,000 Korean Americans and others who maybe have not ever donated before, committing $1 a day for our neighbors. And I have to shout out here that Dr. Kim is one of our $1 a day donors too. So thank you.
All right, so we're running out of time. Dr. Kim, if you could give us some parting words in terms of building our Korean American community, and then building it for ourselves, and then building it outward.
Yeah. Well, I would just, I was just in Korea. I was in Korea twice recently, and I have to say I was just blown away by what's going on there. Korea is a country still, South Korea, with almost no natural resources, and they're just still everybody there is thinking, what do we need to do? Not only are they thinking really seriously about sustainability and the environment, I mean, they've got an incredible plan on sustainability, but they're constantly thinking about what is it going to take for us to be competitive in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. It's the only country I've ever seen that has a ministry of the knowledge economy, because they know that it's knowledge that's going to be key in taking the country forward. So I think that if we here, Korean Americans, can match that kind of intensity that the Koreans have, and you know, the thing is, it's not just, you know, making semiconductors. You know, Korea is intending to export culture, movies, music, literature to everybody in the world. I just think we have to match their level of ambition and say, what does it take? I think it takes ministers. I think it takes community organizers. I think it takes, you know, people who are physicians and lawyers and everyone else. But we've got to now say, as a Korean American community, what is the most ambitious, transformational thing we can think of to do together to have an impact on this society and to have an impact on the world? There's no question. We have so many incredibly successful people that we need to make ourselves visible to the world, but we also have to do the things that are going to be transformative. And I think these two absolutely are leading us in that direction.
Indeed. Eugene Cho, Kyung-Yoon, Dr. Jim Kim, thank you so much for your time today. It's been amazing. I feel like I've learned so much. I hope you all have too. And before we say goodbye, I want to invite the new KEI president, An Manzulo, back up here to say a final, oh, there he is, final closing remarks to say goodbye and have a great afternoon. Thank you for your time today.